Hi, I'm Reverend Jake Zabe, and welcome to Children's Bible Stories. Alright children, our Bible story for today is going to be the story of Esau selling his birthright. So, Jacob and Esau were twin brothers. Esau was red and hairy, and so his name meant hairy. That's what Esau means. He also was known as Edom, from the name meaning red. That was kind of his nickname. Jacob, however, was smooth and had a more lighter, paler skin. And his name, Jacob, meant heel grabber, because he came out of the womb grabbing his brother's heel. But heel grabber also referred to somebody who trips somebody up, somebody who's a bit sneaky and deceitful and underhanded and undermines people. And as the boys grew, Esau became a mighty hunter, like his father Isaac. And so his father Isaac loved him more. As for Jacob, he was a more quiet, gentle man, and he spent more time at home with his mother, helping around the house and cooking food and looking after the animals. And so his mother loved him more. Now one day, Jacob was at home cooking some stew, and his brother Esau came in from hunting, and he'd been unable to get anything that day. So he was tired and exhausted, and he was starving. And he came in and he saw Jacob cooking some yummy stew, and he smelled it and said, "Oh, that smells so good. Brother, I'm starving. I've caught nothing today. I'm exhausted. Can you please give me some of your stew?" And Jacob was very clever and sneaky, and he says, "Oh, my poor hungry brother. Yeah, I can give you some stew." And Esau's like, "Oh, great, good." But Jacob said, "On one condition." "Oh, what condition?" said Esau. "Well, you have to sell to me your birthright. I get to receive the birthright blessing, not you." And Esau's like, "Fine, whatever. It's just a silly birthright and I'm starving. Why would I care about that? Give me some stew. You can have my stupid old birthright." And so Jacob gave him a bowl of stew, and Esau ate it down real quick. Now, what is interesting about this story is that the birthright wasn't just an ordinary inheritance for the people of God. See, because the birthright here refers to a person's inheritance. But this wasn't the only thing Jacob was trying to get. He wasn't just trying to get his father's property, because in the Israelite inheritance laws, both sons inherited property anyway. The older brother would just get a double portion. So in this case, Esau would have 2/3 of the property and Jacob would still end up with 1/3. But there was something extra special with Esau's birthright. And that's because these were God's people. God had originally chosen Abraham to be the chosen person through which God would bring the Messiah. And then Abraham had a couple sons. He had Ishmael with Hagar. He had Isaac with Sarah, and later he'd have a couple of sons with a woman named Keturah. But God promised that it was through Isaac that the Abrahamic covenant would be fulfilled. That it was through Isaac that the nations of the world would be blessed. That it was through Isaac that the Messiah would come. And this covenant promise was to be passed down from Abraham to Isaac, and then to his oldest son, Esau. However, God had already promised Rebekah that the older son would rule the younger. And so even though Esau was meant to receive this blessing by birthright, God had already foretold that the promise would end up being given to Jacob and not Esau. And here is where that prophecy first begins to take place. Because Esau was meant to receive the Abrahamic covenant by right of his birth, but he gave it up, and he gave it to Jacob instead for a bowl of stew. Esau gave up the promise of the Messiah, gave up the Abrahamic covenant, gave up his salvation for a bowl of stew. And what is interesting about the Jacob and Esau story is how this is later mirrored by the Jewish people in the time of Jesus. So Jesus came as the Jewish Messiah. He repeatedly said things like he'd come not to save the nations, but to save the Jews. He tells the Canaanite woman that he's come not to her, but he's come to save the lost sheep of Israel. Jesus came as the Jewish Messiah. But the Gospel of John tells us that Jesus came to his own, and that his own rejected him. The Pharisees and the scribes and the chief priests and the Jewish people rejected their Messiah. However, the Gentiles, they came to Jesus instead and received him as the Messiah. In the book of Romans, St. Paul speaks of an olive tree, this being the Jewish people. And Paul says those Jews who have rejected the Messiah, they have been broken off of this tree. Whereas the Gentiles are wild olives. They aren't part of God's tree. But for those who believe in the Messiah, God has now grafted them into the tree. In the same way that Esau had the promise of the Messiah by birth, but gave it up for a bowl of stew, and Jacob, who didn't have the promise of the Messiah, managed to receive it. Likewise, the Jewish people had the promise of the Messiah by right of birth, and they rejected him. And the Gentiles, who didn't have the promise of the Messiah by right of birth, through faith, have now received the Messiah and received their salvation. And so you see, children, many people think about Jacob as being the naughty one in this story because he stole his brother's birthright. But actually, the naughty one in this story is Esau, who sold his birthright for nothing but a bowl of stew. The birthright was not just money and property. The birthright was the promise of the Messiah. Not just earthly riches, but heavenly riches. And Esau gave that up. Whereas Jacob, who didn't have that promise by birth, he saw it as something worth getting. He saw it as something that should be desired, as something valuable and important, and he went out of his way to get it. See, Jesus tells us that we need to be as gentle as doves and as shrewd as serpents. We need to be sneaky to get the promises of God. And that is what Jacob did. Yes, he was sneaky. He was shrewd like a serpent. But he saw the promise of the Messiah as something worthwhile getting. And we Gentiles need to be like that also. We aren't part of God's chosen people by birth. We're not Jews. But through faith in Jesus, we take something that is not ours by birth and we make it our own. We see Jesus and the promise of the Messiah for what it is, a true heavenly treasure. The Jews have rejected this great treasure of the Messiah, and if they're going to throw it away, we are going to pick it up and take it. Consider the parable that Jesus tells to the Canaanite woman. He says it's not right to take the children's bread and give it to dogs. And she responds by saying, yes, but the dogs will eat whatever falls from their master's table. The Jews were the children. They were given the bread of the Messiah, and some of them, like Peter and Paul, believed and they ate it. But other Jews, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they picked up that bread and they threw it on the ground. And then Gentiles, like Cornelius and others, they saw this bread lying on the ground and they said, well, if you Jews won't eat it, then I will eat it. And so Esau had this promise, and he threw it away, and Jacob said, well, if you're not going to have it, I'll take it. And that's our Bible story for today, children. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.